Okay. David Dayen is the executive editor of American Prospect, a magazine about ideas, politics, and power. He is the author of Chain of Title, How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud. That was in 2016. Winner of the Studs and Ida Turkel Prize. Uh, Good labor guy there. um, and Monopolized, Life in the Age of Corporate Power. I'm finding it very fascinating, especially chapter 6, but we won't go there right now. He writes extensively about economics and politics at the Prospect and was the winner of the 2021 Hillman Prize for magazine journalism. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, The Intercept, The New Republic, Huffington Post, I assume, or HuffPost, it says, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and more. He's been a guest on MSNBC, CNN, Bloomberg, CNBC, NPR, and Pacifica Radio. He lives in Los Angeles. Okay. How the topic is how Wall Street is moving to Silicon Valley, how financial deregulation led Wall Street to monopolize the American economy. Then about the talk, how should we think about the current state of U.S. finance and its consolidation of basic banking, the rollback of regulatory enforcement, and dominance of private lending and alternative investors, and the rise of private equity and shadow banking and its impact monopolizing of the economy. We can focus on the challenge of the tech industry, which clearly wants to take over the banking and payment networks. A lot going on there. More.
David Dayen, thank you so much for joining us. My
Thank you for having me.
my gratitude to you extends beyond your amazing book, Chain of Title, which was a huge part of the post-financial collapse conversation. And it extends well beyond Monopolize, which I want to return to in a second. My appreciation is I read you every time the American Prospect comes out, and I listen to your podcast, and I've found your Organized Money podcast, and I just want to urge others to take advantage of the work of our best financial journalists. We heard from Gretchen Morgenson, and we had a presentation from her yesterday. I hope people are cued into what she's doing, and I hope they really come into the fold of your reporting, which on the 2020 pandemic bailout, I think was the best reporting we had dealing with the Fed's bailout of the special investment vehicles, and was widely praised by the people that we follow and a whole range of others. Adam Tooze, a whole range of people have praised your reporting. So with that said, I want to say that your talk is on Silicon Valley taking over the Wall Street sector. We obviously have crypto winning the last election. We've got the Genius Act. We've got 401ks being invested in private equity. We've got a lot to talk about. We had the collapse of the bank in Silicon Valley. But before you get to that, or as the lead up to it, or the wind up before the pitch, I hope you will let our audience know what you have done in Monopolized, because as I listen to it, you start us out in the airport, stuck in an airplane, and you show us what they did to airplane. I have a nephew who's an airplane pilot, and he got his pilot license out of the post 9/11 period and lived through every one of the traumas you described from the point of view of the pilots. You go through then the devastation of the American family farm. You describe the digital divide, which affects my rural neighbors and my inner city Flint neighbors who are suffering from an extreme digital divide. You then you take us straight to Amazon and how it's crushing small business and remaking retail and all of Main Street. You take us to hospitals and the remaking of healthcare. These are specific stories that are so crucial to what we're doing because they're money stories. And I even think you have an answer to the abundance agenda. If we were David Dayen, we would get out there and we would say, why doesn't Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson talk about monopoly? Because your chapter is an answer to their abundance book, and it's not been fronted in that way. The reason I think you fit in the sweet spot of the tennis racket of monetary reform for the AMI is in chapter 6. You make the argument that the deregulation and liberalization of finance and the deregulation of the banking sector and the growth of the super banks, you have a great thing on Citibank and their involvement in Enron and then
Hmm.
WorldCom and then the subprime lending,
Hmm.
led to the monopolization of the Wall Street and the banking sector and the growth of shadow banking. And your argument is, and this is the point, that you say that led to the monopolization of every sector. And I want this group to hear that argument and make that connection as you launch off into Silicon Valley, try to take over Wall Street, which is really the next step on the conveyor belt.
Right.
So I just wanted to do that as a framing, and you get 40 minutes and a lot of questions after that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that intro, both Stephen and you. It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me. And yeah, the book I wrote, Monopolize, was came out in 2020. Obviously, many things in the world have changed since then. I would like to say that we no longer have a monopoly problem in 2025, but that would not be true. And in fact, although the Biden administration had a very aggressive antitrust agenda and made some real gains in that arena because of 40 years of deregulation and consolidation that they were working against, they were unable to clean up everything, and then now we have a Trump administration that is mostly interested in using antitrust as part of a sort of pay-to-play corruption scheme. So, and we can talk about that later. But um, that was a nice setup to talk about how banking plays into this, and indeed drives much of the consolidation that we see in our economy. It was already put before you that we have concentrated sectors in almost everywhere that you look. The consolidation of banking and Wall Street drives the consolidation of everything else. And here's how. So, in the 1930s, after the Great Depression, we put in banking laws that were specifically guided toward decentralization of the banking sector. As recently as the 1980s, there were certain states that didn't allow, Texas, Illinois, for example, didn't allow more than one branch of any bank to be within their borders. Now we have a situation where JP Morgan has a branch in every single state except in the contiguous US, except for Alaska and Hawaii. Right now, small businesses, which used to thrive on relationship lending with a local community bank, over 50% of all small businesses have a big bank as their primary financial services provider. The six largest banks in the country control roughly 60% of total assets in the United States. So obviously, there's been this big change from the 1930s. And when did that start? The deregulation started happening in the 1970s, actually, with Jimmy Carter. By the time Bill Clinton and Robert Rubin killed the Glass-Steagall Act, which was the separation of investment and commercial banking, it was already dead. There was a chipping away of that system of separation, such that the sort of bold play by Citigroup to merge with Travelers Insurance and kind of dare the system to stop it was just the last in a long chain of ways in which banking was becoming more connected and investment banking and commercial banking was becoming one and the same. When we finally got the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act in 1998 or 99, then what was sort of an open secret became the law. And combined with that, the Neil Regal Act, which allowed branch banking in more than one state. And the financial crisis itself, which, partially stemmed not only from Glass-Steagall's end, but the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which is responsible as anything for the financial crisis because that deregulated the derivative sector. And as a result, there were more bets placed on the housing market bets which eventually failed, and because of the tight coupling of the financial system, those losses cascaded through all kinds of banks all over the world and created the financial crisis we had. After that, banks only got bigger because the failed or failing banks were sort of in shotgun weddings put together with the largest banks in the country. And then we had the sort of spectacle of too big to fail, where the biggest banks, despite having their own problems, were given massive amounts of money by the Federal Reserve, ability to use the discount window to bulk up. And this is where you got this continued consolidation up to the points with the statistics that I gave you at the beginning. So the post-financial crisis rules, through the Dodd-Frank Act, were an attempt to kind of fight the last war, stop the things that were happening in the run-up to the crisis. So there was some decent rules around lending standards, particularly in mortgages. And there was an attempt to stop proprietary trading, where banks were prohibited from trading with other people's money, essentially, trading on their own accounts. That had more of a mixed success, and we certainly see certain levels of proprietary trading today. But those were the kinds of things that the financial crisis, post-financial crisis reforms were focused on. As a result, what is known as M&A, or merger and acquisition banking, became a much bigger part of bank revenue. And I tell in my book kind of a fascinating story where there was a merger between two of the largest beer companies in the world, AB InBev and not even remembering what the old company was right now, Molson Coors maybe. And there were 11 banks and 8 law firms that consulted on that single merger. This is one merger in the beer industry. And what that sort of displayed to me is the importance of M&A as part of the overall picture of banking. We don't talk about it a whole lot, but it's super important. More shares are retired through mergers and acquisitions in the the merging of firms than are retired through stock buybacks. And there's more money that is spread around through golden parachutes and the money given to CEOs to leave a company and in the wake of a merger. That is sort of the grease that moves the wheels of mergers and acquisitions. And banks compete for this business. There's a competition for removing competition from the U.S. economy. The banks have this thing called the league tables. And the league tables are a list of who has made the most M&A investment revenue through the course of a particular year. And the biggest banks in the world, JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and Wells Fargo and Bank of America, are all at the top of the league tables. And anytime you put together a list, people compete to be at the top of the list. And they'll even just, if they get to sit in on a meeting, they get to put it on their league tables. And now there's a very important couple of things that you have to know in association with that. One of the ways that banks get paid on M&A is through what they call the success fee. And the success fee means if the merger goes through, the bank gets paid. And so the bank now has an incentive not only to do more mergers, but to make sure that merger succeeds, and to make sure that merger goes through the proper steps. And so you can imagine the lobbying that gets done. You can imagine the desire for banks to continue to consolidate the economy. And all of these things, whether you're talking about the league tables or the success fee, provides incentives to monopolize the economy. Wall Street likes it because it's seen, historically since the 1980s, there's been this belief that consolidation and concentration makes companies more efficient. And banks like it because it's a revenue line of business. That is the real reason that we see a lot of consolidation within the economy, in my view, that there is the biggest and most powerful institutions in our country have a real desire to continue the gravy train of consolidation. They're being paid off as a result. That created, throughout the 2000s and the 2010s, as M&A became a bigger part of the business, a real drive towards consolidation. And the statistics bear that out. 2/3 of all firms, all sectors in the economy got more consolidated, according to a 2016 report by President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. So, this became something that journalists like myself and advocates and think tanks started to talk about, particularly in the end of the Obama era and the first Trump term. And when the Biden administration got into office, they took a different approach, a radically different approach to consolidation and concentration in the U.S. economy. They hired Lena Khan to run the Federal Trade Commission. They hired Jonathan Cantor to run the antitrust division of the Justice Department, and they hired Rohit Chopra to be the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and he was very focused on breaking up concentrations of power as well. And in addition to some other figures within the administration, they really went hard on monopolies throughout the economy. You're talking about lawsuits against Google, against Facebook, against Amazon, against Apple, against Visa, against Live Nation Ticketmaster, against RealPage, which is this company in real estate that they gain proprietary information from landlords in a particular community and use that information to raise prices. There were a number of monopolization lawsuits. There were a number of merger challenges, many of them successful. Kroger and Albertsons tried to merge. That was blocked by a court because the FTC sued Simon & Schuster and Penguin Random House. That was blocked because the Justice Department sued. And there are a number of others. I could sit here for days and tell you about that. Obviously, they only had 4 years. And when that ended, the Trump administration came to power. And we have that tableau at the inauguration, which I think says a lot about this particular political and economic moment, where the president was sworn in the Capitol Rotunda with the heads of all of the major big tech firms standing just 2 rows behind him, actually in front of his own cabinet selections. And that tells you something about, there's a line of where you stand depends on where you sit. They were sitting very close to the president, and I think that proximity has played through. One of the first things that the Trump administration moved to essentially shut down through the Department of Government Efficiency and Elon Musk was the CFPB. And there were very specific reasons for that. It turns out the CFPB, at the end of its 4 years under Rohit Chopra, was initiating something called the larger participant rule. And the larger participant rule would have extended the enhanced supervisory conditions that the CFPB applies to banks, also to big tech companies who are moving into payments. And Elon Musk wants to make X the everything app and include, make it like some of these Chinese apps that we have and include payments as part of that. And so he saw that as an immediate threat. They moved to stop the participation rule, to stop any new large tech firms from being added to the way the larger participant rule works is that the authority is given and then each outside non-bank has to be designated as a larger participant and then put into this regulatory regime. One of the first things they do is block any new firms from being added to that larger participant designation. And right now the CFPB is essentially a shell. It's there's nothing really going on at the CFPB. I know personally workers who are just being paid to do essentially nothing, and that's the lion's share of the 1,500 workers who previously tried to prevent scams and fraud in our economy. So not just X, but Facebook and other companies have this real desire to move into the payment system. And you kind of see in this Wall Street being challenged by the very thing that it helped create. So Wall Street, through M&A banking and through the desire to consolidate, creates these giants in Silicon Valley. We named them before: Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook. To a lesser extent, some of the Elon Musk companies like Tesla and X. And now these companies want to challenge some of the fundamental basics of banking. And they want to do that not just through fintech and using peer-to-peer payment systems, but also through the establishment of crypto and using stablecoins and things of that nature. So one thing I think we need to know about fintech is that this entire regime has not gone well. Anytime you put something outside the regulatory perimeter, you are asking for trouble. You're bound to run into problems. One of the biggest, and it happened last year, I believe it was last May, there was a company that was a middleman that was it was connecting fintech companies to sponsor banks that would enable the use of payment apps. And it was called Synapse. It was known as basically a bank as a service kind of connector to allow fintechs to engage in their operations, and then they would keep their custodial assets at the sponsor bank. Well, Synapse went bankrupt, and it turned out that nobody had a handle on what the ledger actually looked like at Synapse when it was in a dying state. And it was operating with these sponsor banks, but there were these huge shortfalls on the ledger that corresponded to some of the apps like Yada and some of the other fintech apps where customers had their accounts. So nobody could figure out where the customer account money was actually being held. This started, as I said, close to a year and a half ago. And many of those people, individual, retail customers who probably thought they had an FDIC insured account because that was kind of intimated at these fintech apps, they have not been able to retrieve their money in a year and a half. Some of these people, it was their entire store of value, their entire life savings. And it's all because you had these middleman relationships that were confused, and one, dropout of a link in the chain of this intermediation ended up causing this incredible crisis. So that's the risk that we take if we, move to this system where we have, essentially tech firms, tech apps, trying to replicate the business of banking, but having to, shoehorn willing sponsor banks into the equation in order to get around, certain requirements. So, I think the interesting state of play right now, I mean, obviously Wall Street is doing fine. There is deregulation at the Securities and Exchange Commission. There's now a more permissive antitrust environment, which is juicing M&A. They're making more money on trading. They have been for some time because interest rates have been higher. They're making more money on lending, to the extent they do any lending, because loans, as was intimated before, have been serviced out to private markets, which do a tremendous number of lending, once again, outside the regulatory perimeter, which is sort of the shadow banking problem that got us into trouble during the financial crisis. But in a number of fights between Wall Street and Silicon Valley, or Wall Street and tech writ large, if you want to call it that, Silicon Valley is winning. And one was alluded to before, which is crypto. The crypto industry put something like $150 million into the 2024 elections. And they ended up being wildly successful. Every primary or general election fight that they initiated, particularly in the general election, I think there was 37 campaigns that they contributed to, and they won 36. The only one that didn't win was Elizabeth Warren's race in Massachusetts. And so obviously crypto bought the US Congress, and they went right to work. The main bill that has passed so far, as mentioned, is called the Genius Act. The Genius Act, it's an acronym, and I don't really know what it stands for or care, but the S stands for stablecoin. And this is an attempt to create a regulatory regime, which is very light touch, around stablecoins. And stablecoins are these dollar-like instruments that are pegged, allegedly pegged, one-to-one with treasuries or some other super safe instruments, and they enable people to buy them and then trade or pay off or engage in things through buying crypto. The problem with using crypto and Bitcoin or these other notes as an instrument where you transact is that it's very volatile. It goes up and down all the time. Stablecoins are supposed to be more stable. Obviously, it's in the name. And so it's supposed to facilitate commerce, essentially. That's the theory. What it's really done is enable people to buy crypto. We saw in 2022 with the sort of crypto winter, the crash of FTX and some of these other companies that were out there that, facilitating the purchase of more and more digital assets, which are used largely for gambling, a form of casino gambling. Sometimes we referred to that during derivatives in the financial crisis, and this is just a more overt form of it with a lot of retail investors that aren't very sophisticated. That's what a stablecoin regime, in my view, does. And the other thing that it can do is allow these tech firms like X, like Meta, to basically have their own private currencies denominated in stablecoins. They get to, wind down to the lowest common denominator in terms of regulation, whether it's at the state level or through the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. And this creates a direct kind of challenge to the banking system as we've known it. And yet the banks were pretty muted in talking about the Genius Act. There were some community banking operations in places like Texas, and I think Texas was the main one that objected to the Genius Act, but ultimately it passed with little opposition from the banking sector. And yet it represents a real challenge to the banking sector. It also represents a possibility for where the next crash could come from. Because as I mentioned, stablecoins buy treasury assets or other kinds of super safe assets in order to maintain their peg to the US dollar. That means that these stablecoins, as they get bigger, could really be market moving in terms of the treasury markets or these other markets that they invest in. And if that stablecoin gets too overextended, you're talking about a run potentially in the treasury market. So this is something that I think a lot of people who follow this are very, very, very concerned about. So that's one example. Another one that was mentioned is opening up 401ks. So private equity, which is sort of an alternative asset player in the sort of larger financial sector, has been for years trying to get into 401ks so they could get a piece of a 401k market of individual retirement accounts that is something like $11 trillion. So obviously with their needs and their desire to buy up more companies, it's another form of monopolization. Often what private equity engages in is what's called a roll-up, where they find every company within a particular sector and roll them up and build a dominant firm. Obviously having more money in dry powder to be able to do that, even though much of that money is sort of leveraged and much of the money, much of these companies are bought primarily on debt. But you need the capital to leverage in order to make those transactions. So they were hopeful that the Trump administration would move to allowing 401ks to open up to crypto and give them much stronger. The plan sponsors wanted guarantees that they wouldn't be held liable if these investments went bust. And the Trump administration has shown themselves willing to do that. However, they're also wanting to give individual retirement savers the ability to buy crypto within those 401k plans. And obviously, crypto is probably more well known to the average investor than private equity. And so private equity was building towards this for years and years and years. And now they see crypto sneak in, and it's probably going to get a larger share of the ultimate money that goes to these kinds of alternative assets. Another example is the so-called open banking rule. The open banking rule is something that Rohit Chopra at the CFPB put together to allow people to move their money seamlessly from one bank to another. In other words, giving the information that enables that seamless transition from one financial account to a different financial account. Obviously, the banking sector doesn't like this. They prefer to have people locked in to their depository institutions. But interestingly, the fintech sector really likes this, right? They want to be able to get that information so that they can get accounts out of the banking sector and into their fintech apps. And so there's been an interesting fight within the Trump administration over the future of the open banking rule. Another one are these orders for so-called debanking, this idea that people are denied bank accounts because of various sometimes they say religious reasons or political reasons. In reality, to the extent that there's any debanking going on, it's because the assets themselves are volatile and dangerous. But this whole concept of debanking has largely been driven by the crypto sector, which says that banks should essentially be forced to, handle crypto accounts and things of that nature. The banks have been nervous about that. They don't want to be forced to transact with people who they see as a risk. And it's another fight between the tech sector and the financial sector. So there are a number of these kinds of interesting Silicon Valley versus Wall Street fights that have come up. And Wall Street is, while they are doing fine, as I said, they're losing a lot of these fights to the new tech right. It sets up kind of an uncertain future. Now, when we see the kind of the nexus between Silicon Valley and Wall Street, the system works as it has worked in the past. So an example that we alluded to was the fall of Silicon Valley Bank in 2023. Now, that was kind of a standard system, a standard failure in terms of this. It was high interest rates, which got Silicon Valley Bank locked into a lot of loans and a lot of assets, I should say, that ended up going down in value. And it was the classic kind of run on a bank. But the interesting thing here is that the particular individuals who were invested in Silicon Valley Bank represented a lot of the venture capitalists and tech sector CEOs who had used these banks completely disregarding the typical limits on FDIC insurance. You had individual accounts with hundreds of millions of dollars in them when we know the FDIC insures only up to $250,000. So, it could have easily been a situation where they say, look, you knew the risks. There are easy ways. Excuse me. Just a sec. Sorry. The financial sector could have said, you know how to broker deposits. There are easy ways to deal with this. and you didn't, and now you have to suffer the consequences. But no, that's not what happened. The Fed ended up protecting all of those accounts, even the ones that had hundreds of billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars in them. It protected the entire system, and it gave this term lending operation to enable not just Silicon Valley Bank, but these other banks that were in trouble because of this mismatch, the ability to borrow at very low levels and engage in kind of a carry trade. So that to me was kind of an example that the financial sector still retains its full ability to. Thank you. Financial sector still retains all the ability to get bailouts, to ensure that their assets are protected. And in this case, with Silicon Valley Bank, it was kind of in concert with the tech sector. And they both, when they have the same goals, they can work within the system to enable the conditions that they want. So, let me just wrap up here because I appear to be losing my voice. So what are the solutions to this? Well, I mean, obviously, I think in the next few years, you're not going to see a whole lot in terms of what the Trump administration is going to do. We'll be lucky if we get through this with a CFPB shell intact. But I think that what we're seeing right now, I think there are possibilities that we could see some real turbulence in the financial system, particularly with the rise of crypto and using that as more of a semi-sanctioned instrument. And I think the moment right now calls for putting a lot of ideas on the shelf for what we are going to do in the potential aftermath of another financial downturn and another financial crisis. Because typically what we've seen is that the pendulum swings back and forth. You get a crisis, you get a lot of regulations that are put in during the crisis, and then people tend to forget, and the pendulum starts swinging away from regulation, which is certainly what the path that we are on now. And that leads to too much risk bubbling up in the system and then another crisis. So the question is, are we going to get back to the kind of safe, stable, boring banking system that we had in place in the 1930s and 40s with the kind of safeguards that were put in through the New Deal, so that we don't get this boom and bust cycle, and that we can manage the risks more prudently. So with that, I will take a lozenge and then take your questions.
Thank you so much. I want to end with my question with a solutions question. And it's exactly what you do in the book. But before I get to my question, I just want to tell everyone that the way you wrote your book is very much the way Gretchen Morgenson told her story of her book. And I urge you, if you can, to watch our video of her talk. Because if people read your book, they're going to see inside the lives of people in each of
Right.
these sectors, the harms and the suffering and the real life hardships and the loss of the American dream and the palpable loss of potential that this country is accepting with this level of monopolization. I didn't really understand monopolization in the way that you told the story so as to get motivated to really care about it. And that's why I'm just making another plug for your book. But your solutions chapter actually got me inspired. So maybe you can end with telling the solutions chapter. I'll just cue it up. You went from Chicago to Tel Aviv to meet a guy named Guy Rolnick, who you
Right.
met at the University of Chicago, who in 1997 was launching a movement in economic and political reform. And he was a person who had served in the IDF and gotten a deep look inside the way the Israeli economy worked. And according to your account, he saw levels of corruption and monopolization and privatization in the banking sector, with the pensions, with the collapse of the Israeli banks. And in each area that affected him, including journalism, airlines, supermarkets, cell providers, cement. And so
Mhm.
his theory, as you heard it before you went to Tel Aviv to find out what he did later, was his theory, Guy Rolnick's theory, was if you control the banks and the insurance companies, you also control the media and you have a lock on democracy. So that would be another woe is me
Mhm.
tale of woe, but that's just the lead up to the chapter. And you get to him after hammering us on how the people who deregulated antitrust did their work. And you tell about the lawyers and you tell about the think tanks. But you end with Guy Rolnick. It's kind of a David and Goliath story. And he ends up raising $4 million and creating a website, a financial journalism website. And he ends up going into a campaign mode and capturing the imagination of the entire country and
Yeah.
actually accomplishing real change. And I hope you end on that story because you end your book on that story and it left
Mhm.
me hopeful.
It's very self-serving. I say journalism can fight monopoly. um, but yeah, I mean, that was true. And I mean, Israel's a small country, and it's sorry, guys. Just give me a second.
Take your time, no rush.
So, yeah, Israel's a small country. Sometimes it's, the idea that you could do this in the United States, you'd have to, maybe it can happen, maybe not, but they really did use the tools of journalism to inform the public about what was kind of a hidden system of tycoons that were controlling the Israeli economy. And this came hand in hand with something we know here in the United States: higher housing prices, higher food prices. And there was a kind of revolt in the 2010s in Israel. Many tent cities, it was kind of a proto or a version of Occupy, where you had people going out into the streets, particularly in Tel Aviv, in huge numbers. I mean, like 10 to 20% of the entire country being out in the streets. And on these tents, there were, pages from the marker that were, read this in order to check up on these things. And this is during a conservative government, a Likudnik government, Netanyahu's in charge. And they do get reforms to this tycoon system such that, for example, you mentioned cell phones. The cell phone prices in Israel dropped by 95% when they broke up the concentration of power in that particular market. So it is a kind of a heartening example. And, Monopolize was written in 2020. What we saw in the U.S. in those 4 years when Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor and Tim Wu and Rohit Chopra were in charge is a manifestation of that. They really did change the way that the U.S. enforced the antitrust laws, and they made real changes. A good example is the inhaler market, which there were attempts to use patent thickets and a bunch of tricks and traps to make inhalers fantastically expensive. And they put in a rule that dropped the price of inhalers down to $35. And it was really, really, really successful. And there are many, many such examples of that happened over the last 4 years. Obviously, the administration changes, and now we're in a bad place. But the point is, we know how to fix the monopoly problem. You enforce the laws that are on the books. And there are more laws that obviously can be brought through in that same anti-monopoly spirit, because anti-monopoly is not just antitrust. You can have regulatory laws outside of merger challenges or monopolization cases that tend to, reduce or limit concentrations of power. So, I think that what you can be heartened by is the fact that we actually did this in the United States, and we did this over the last 4 years. And if we continue to demand something to deal with these large monopoly companies that are threatening our ability to use our talents, our economic liberties, our very way of life, uh, we know that we have a system in place that can actually respond to it.
Patrick, you're muted.
Do you want to take over from here and ask questions? We've got Joe and Nelson and Mike with their
Yeah,
hands up.
I have one quick question, David. Is
Mhm.
that you explain in your book how corporations help educate other corporations, basically,
Mhm.
because they're the ones starting out with this monopolization inside their industry, if you will. And
Mhm.
they send to, and other corporations are learning from them. Do I got that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, there is. I think what gets learned is that the kind of ways in which you can use your market power in particular, with particular methods. So, when we talk about these monopolized sectors, it's the same thing that they keep doing over and over. It's exclusive dealing. It's
Mhm.
catch and kill, where they buy another company and just that's competing with it and just kill the product that is being competed with. Um, it's a whole host of things like that they don't really vary that much from sector to sector. They may seem like wildly different in terms of whether it's airlines or journalism or e-commerce or whatever, but it's really the same techniques, and that's been true, since the original monopolies, the trusts of the progressive pre-progressive era, the Gilded Age.
Yeah, the later 1800s. Let thank you. Let's go to Joe Polito, and you have the floor, Joe, to ask the question.
Thanks so much for that presentation. And thanks to Patrick for getting journalists involved this year because uh, Steve has added to the economists and sociologists and law professors the very practical profession of journalism. You folks know how to communicate better to the general public. And Gretchen showed the same yesterday. Um, I will say that American Monetary Institute and monetary reformers in general are also monopoly advocates. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there are many kinds of monopoly, and back to Adam Smith and monopoly of land and housing. But we're about the monopoly of money. The money
Right.
should be at commons as well, and um, we ask very simply, if we have the federal power to create money, we the people, why are we paying interest? Why are governments paying interest to create for you, to pay to you, the banks, to pay uh, to issue our money? We can do it
I mean,
ourselves.
it's
And I
yeah.
hope the journalists take up that quest as well, that
Well, it's
monopoly.
an interesting thing. I mean, the government basically outsources money creation to the banking sector.
Right.
And one of the reasons historically that they said that is a good thing for us to do is because the banks are on the ground. They understand their local communities, and they know where to distribute that money. Flash forward to today, and as I mentioned, small businesses, over half of them are using a giant bank as their financial services provider. They're not on the ground. When you have Wells Fargo lending to somebody in California, or PNC Bank lending to someone in Seattle, it disrupts that entire theory by which money creation was outsourced to the banks. And certainly in the small business sector, it's a small part of a bank's overall earnings potential, and they end up caring less about small businesses, which also, by the way, monopolizes the economy. If small businesses are more likely to fail because of failures among their banks and their inability to access credit, then only the strong survive. And so I do think that there are definite linkages there, and and I heard you had Morgan Ricks, who has great ideas about how to reimagine the outsourcing of the money creation power from banks to take it back in-house. I think those ideas are great, and I've covered them in the past. And, I do think that there's a lot of connection here.
Thanks so much. You take care. It's a great
Thanks.
presentation. Bye now.
Lucille, is there a question from the chat?
No, I'm not monitoring. the
Okay,
chat.
go ahead, have your turn. And then Mike and Nelson's had a turn. So Nelson, you got to wait to number 3 now, if you could.
Okay.
Hi, David. Thank you for your presentation and more importantly, your work behind it. I have to, I guess, piggyback on the question that Joe just asked in the sense that if I listened carefully enough to your answer, you said that government outsourced the money system, money itself or credit, because banks are local.
That was the theory. I mean, that was the theory initially. Yeah.
Well, banks were already local before the Fed was founded. Banks were already local before the United States was founded, and banks in Europe. And the money creation process itself, that we have today is also a historic, goes back to, frankly, the 12, 13, 1400s and institutionalized in the way we have it today between the 15 and 1600s, and specifically the end of the 1600s in England. But the problem is not what many people think banks do today is this intermediating of helping money really that is already in existence get and be there at the local level. And that's not what they're doing. They're creating what we use as money. And there's a difference between those two. And you're saying, right, so you get it. But journalists like you, I mean, are you talking about that? Because it's older, and the Fed, and even, the Fed itself, let's stay there, was set up with the bankers' interests to do it the way it is. And
Right.
so citing the changes that happened in the 30s, if it doesn't function as money, the system can't continue. So they needed those shoring up reforms to keep it functioning as money so they could extract in the process. And to just go back to that little partnership in the 30s that has already shown itself not to be survivable because you get around it. Like, just, I don't know. I'm going to stop there because maybe you know what I'm talking about. But are you talking about that issue, that the difference between banking as creating our money out of credit versus public money, 100% public money that is issued, enters circulation for the public good, and then it circulates in perpetuity. It doesn't need to disappear as credit does.
I can't speak to other journalists, but I've certainly written about public banking in the past. I see people from the Public Banking Institute on here.
Public money, I'm talking about, not public.
Right, a little different.
Public money, big difference.
So, what I will say is that I think the way, journalists can get involved is talk about the real world harms of the current system. So I have a piece coming up later this week that actually talks about banks and small businesses and cites 2 case studies of viable small businesses, one a startup, the other a 40-year construction firm in the Pacific Northwest, which were destroyed by their banks almost entirely. And I talk about the harms of moving from a relationship lending system into a system of remote control, essentially, which is what we have now. So I think my hope is that can spur a discussion about the system that we have, and then we can move to solutions. So I mean, I think the first thing you have to do as an advocate is to identify the problems in the current system. Because if you start immediately by saying we need a new system, the first question inevitably that people have is, well, what's wrong with what we have now? And so I think identifying those harms identifying those areas. And we're also having a very interesting conversation about Federal Reserve independence with respect to the Trump administration trying to impose their own governors and trying to fire one governor for alleged mortgage fraud. We're hearing about this idea that the central bankers need to be independent of any kind of political forces, any kind of basically a separate branch of government. And I think we're finally moving towards a conversation of thinking about that in a real way. Like, why isn't it the case that nobody in the government can have a say in monetary policy whatsoever, right? Like, why is it that elected officials with a responsibility to the public have no ability to get involved in the decision making by remote bankers? Why is it good that we say as kind of almost a virtue that, well, those central bankers are able to make tough decisions on the public if they are insulated from any kind of political response? Why is that a good thing, right? So I think that's another way in which this conversation is actually starting to move in a different direction, and that's another way you can get involved.
Right. I'll just end by saying that was a talk that Leah Downey gave this morning. I encourage you to look up her work. You probably have.
Okay, great.
But I would also, either Stephen or I can send you the legislation that is drafted, that's based on legislation that was introduced in the 2011-12, and now the version is called the American Monetary Reform Act. But it's not just so you know about it and can think about it. It's reform of shifting to public money. It's more elegant and possible than you realize by when we say a whole new system. It's not starting from scratch. So you can read about it. And thank you very much for your work. It's very important what you
great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're bringing up crucial information, and Amra, what Lucia was suggesting is a little accounting change, but it's a big fulcrum point, and the dominoes begin to tumble afterwards. But that's work to be done. Nelson, you have the last question. I think we're out of time shortly.
Thank you. David, thank you very much. I have your book. I haven't read it yet, but I will after this. Okay. A question. I was very disturbed the other day that the Bank of North Dakota had some kind of teaching about fintech. I didn't watch it, but I was very curious because I hope they're not trying to, try to get Bank of North Dakota, our only public bank in this country, to start working with fintech because of the dangers that you just exposed, right?
I hadn't heard that. But yes, I mean, the Bank of North Dakota is kind of this marvel that it still exists in obviously a state that is not necessarily seen as like this great innovator, but they have all these great progressive era reforms, and one of them was the public bank. And it recirculates money locally throughout the economy. It does work with other banks, and so maybe they're by extension trying to work with fintech. I think that's a mistake, but I kind of understand it in that access. I mean, you could see the Bank of North Dakota as kind of almost a central bank of North Dakota in some ways that works with these other branches. But North Dakota was the only state that didn't have a bank fail during the financial crisis. It's not only is the Bank of North Dakota wildly successful, it's also very profitable, and that money gets freed up for more lending. It's a remarkable system. I encourage people. I'm sure everybody on this call already knows all kinds of stuff about it, probably more than me, but I encourage people to look it up. It's a fascinating thing, and I know that there have been attempts, including in my home state of California, to replicate that. And we're moving there. We're getting there by inches in a lot of localities. And I think, obviously what that would do for infrastructure investment and for affordable housing and for all of these things that we were talking about. I mean, abundance was mentioned before. What's left out of that entire conversation is the financing channel. And you can achieve that through this level of rethinking finance in a way that is locally productive. And so it's a good riposte to the idea that no, what we actually need is just deregulate everything. I don't think that that's the case. I think you miss that financing, that very key financing piece. And Bank of North Dakota is a great model for that.
Yeah, like this is safe and boring banking. Back to that, isn't it?
That's right.
The
Yeah.
Bank of North Dakota, right? And one last thing, I want to pick your mind on this one point. I have thought of the idea that Amazon should be a public utility when we're talking about monopolies, right? Because out of that could become a universal basic income for people, for all citizens in this country, the way the Alaska Oil Fund gives people in Alaska, residents of Alaska, a piece of the oil. Instead of the oil in Alaska, we could do it nationwide through Amazon, people having a share of Amazon. It might cost what, $1 trillion if they sell it, if we buy it. We already spent $8 trillion in the so-called war on terror.
Right.
But what's more creative, right?
We've certainly seen sovereign wealth funds across the world. Probably the most successful, and a lot of them are based on oil funds, frankly, which I don't know is something that we necessarily want to promote. But there are other ways to imagine it, and I think the Alaska Permanent Fund's interesting. Norway's sovereign wealth fund and what it does in terms of sustainability is very interesting. The Trump administration has actually talked about a sovereign wealth fund, but I'm not sure that it's gone really past that. I think there are a lot of ways in which if you believe that inequality is a problem, you can't just tackle it through the tax code, because the way that our tax code operates right now is it prefers capital to wage income. And if you have capital, you can just sort of sit on it and earn money that way. And much of it can never, because we don't have wealth taxes in the country, much of it can never be clawed back. And of course, very powerful accountants and consultants have figured out ways to shelter money and things like that. So it's just a fact that in Norway, something like 60 to 70% of all the companies in their stock market are held by this sovereign wealth fund, and it's structured for local benefit, right? Now, in Alaska, you're talking about a few $1,000s that every citizen gets, but on a larger scale, you can really see this as an opportunity to level the playing field. We know that something like 10% of the public owns 70, 80% of all stocks. The way to equalize that and to reduce this preference for capital over wage income is through some sort of public ownership like you're talking about.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry about my voice, but I recovered slightly, so I think we're in good shape.
And we're blessed for the recovery too. So thank you,
David. I want to thank you, and I do want to tell everyone on the call to subscribe to the American Prospect, and I want to tell people to do that out of pure self-interest, because you get in your email stuff you're not going to learn any other way. You get to hear you on the American Prospect live, and I think we've got to feed ourselves with the knowledge that journalists like you have brought to bear, and I want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much. You can check it out at prospect.org, and thank you for having me.
We're going to probably feed you some information on some money ideas too.
Terrific. So, okay. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you, David.